name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
You know, I was actually tempted to preach on Proverbs 31, just for the irony of it. It's actually this magnificent passage about sort of the noble woman. It's translated capable woman. I don't really like that translation. But if you'll recall from reading your Hebrew Bibles, the Proverbs 31 comes right before the book of Ruth. And Ruth is seen as sort of the manifestation or the greatest story about this woman that's described in Proverbs 31. And if you look at her, it might dissipate some of the misconceptions we might have about women before the Victorian era, where, I mean, this woman has her own business, she's got land, she has servants. I mean, you wonder what her husband's doing. Well, it tells you he's sitting at the city gate. Now, I mean, she's just a workhorse, and she's caring for her. It says she's like a ship, right? It says she's caring for her family and for her business. She cares for the poor. But I'll leave all of that for another time. Did you ever notice that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts his suffering and death not once, not twice, but thrice? He repeats it 3 times. Or at least Mark speaks of it three times. The first time is a little bit before in Mark chapter 8, where, remember, Jesus begins to speak about it, and then Peter pulls him aside and says, Jesus, you don't understand. That's not how it's going to go. And Jesus turns around and says, get thou behind me, Satan, and he rebukes Peter. And then Jesus goes on at that time to talk about the cross and how if you want to follow him, you have to take up your own cross and follow him. That's the first time he speaks about his death and suffering. The second time is in today's passage. And what did the disciples say? Nothing. The third time is in chapter 10. And it's preceded by the passage about the rich man, the rich young ruler, as the King James calls him, who comes to Jesus and says, look, I've kept all the commandments from the time I was a child. What do I have to do to be perfect? And Jesus says, well, obviously sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. And he says, well, he doesn't say anything. He goes away because he has a lot of stuff and he likes it. Mark is a terse writer. It's the shortest of all the Gospels. And he doesn't include ornamentation in his gospel. So why would he repeat a very similar content 3 times? You see, you have to compare the disciples' reactions to what Jesus is saying. The first time, Peter pulls Jesus aside and says, you don't get this, Jesus. We're going to be great. And Jesus says, no, and he calls him Satan. So, the second time, this is what it says. They did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. Well, guess why they were afraid? Last time someone challenged him about this, he got called Satan. So, this time they're like, well, doesn't make sense to us, but, he's saying that same thing. We're just going to let this one slide. And then what do? They go on their way to Capernaum, and they start arguing immediately about who's going to be greater when Jesus actually comes into the kingdom, right? They're beginning to feel the tension building up. They know that Jesus is going to be going to Jerusalem soon, and when he goes to Jerusalem, what are they thinking? They're thinking they're going to be the rulers under Jesus. They're going to be the princes, ruling the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And so they're arguing, well, I got taken to the Mount of Transfiguration, you didn't, so obviously I'm going to be above you. So the argument goes. The third time Jesus talks about this, Mark chapter 10. It doesn't really talk about any reaction by the group, but what happens immediately after? John and James, the sons of Zebedee, come up to Jesus and say, well, we need a favor. Because again, they know he's going to go to Jerusalem soon. And Jesus says, well, what favor do you want? And they say, well, when you come into your kingdom, we want to be seated at your right hand and at your left hand. What's going on? The disciples just aren't getting it, are they? At the end, after all three of these stories, immediately following that, is a story of Jesus healing a blind man. And that symbolizes the blindness that his followers have. The blindness that they could not understand what he was saying, even though he spoke plainly. And so Jesus goes and he heals a blind man, and the blind man sees, and his life is changed. But the disciples weren't quite there yet. The disciples, are kind of like me. I read the Gospels, I read about Jesus having to suffer and die, and how we have to carry our own cross and follow him, and I say, man, that was heavy stuff. Jesus is really serious about this. I need another Starbucks. I mean, that is literally the reaction I have sometimes to this. I'm not making this up. I could literally go from reading about this thinking, wow, I really need to do something about this. I'm going to go to Starbucks. We just don't get it. Because maybe we don't want to get it. Maybe we're afraid that if we actually get it, like the blind man whose eyes were open, and we see what Jesus wants of us, we're afraid, like that rich man, for our lives to actually be changed and transformed. We might actually have to sacrifice and give up something that we really like. Maybe we don't want to get it because we don't want our lives to be completely transformed by the Spirit. There are really two things that Jesus is getting at in this passage. One is the suffering and sacrifice of following him. And the other is the humility that requires. The suffering and sacrifice is summed up in the word diakonia, the Greek word for servant in this passage, and the word that we get the word deacon from in English. You see, the diaconal call to service, to attend for the needs of others, to care for others, it's essential to being Christian. It's not something you can be a Christian for long enough, for good enough, and after a while you graduate and go on to the next level. It's not something that goes away when you become a priest or when you've passed a certain level of service. It never goes away. It's always there because it's essential to being a follower of Christ. I was reminded of a movie, and it wasn't a very good one, and I can't even tell you the name of it. But in that movie, there's this young girl. She's in college, and she's trying to, get her music out. She's writing her own songs and stuff like this. And one of the things she does is she finally lands an internship at this big, music producer's place. And so this is her in, right? She wants to meet the music producer, maybe get him to listen to something she's recorded, and so on. Well, the first time he shows up at the studio, he comes in, he starts barking orders at people. You do this, you do that, you do that. And then, without listening to what anyone else has to say, he leaves. He's done. He's done telling people what to say. I think a lot of the world, if you will, thinks of a leader as somebody who does that, who comes in, sort of barks at people, tells them what to do, and leaves. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. To be a servant doesn't mean that you don't lead. Rather, it means that you lead, but you do so with humility. Last Sunday evening, I was hanging out with some friends, and one of them said in passing during the conversation, well, you're a priest, so you get a special place in heaven. I wish that were how it worked. But that's not how it works. Jesus would not even promise his own disciples a special place in heaven. He wouldn't even say, oh yeah, you'll get to sit at my right hand, at my left. He wouldn't do that. Why? Because we're not honored based on what role we've been chosen to do. We're honored in the kingdom of heaven based on the humble service that we've done. The service in secret that God the Father, who knows your secrets, can see. Reminds me sometimes of, you ever see those ginormous checks that people have, and it's like twice the size of a human being, and they parade it about and make sure they get as much media coverage and pictures in before they hand it off? You see, that's the way the world wants to do service. That's the way the world wants to work for charity or to do good. They draw attention to themselves. And they say, look at how much we're donating. And they get a lot of attention. And I tell you, that is their reward. They get what they're looking for, which is attention from other people now. What they don't get is a reward in heaven, because they're not even seeking that. In the kingdom of heaven, we receive rewards and humility. That's why the last become first and the first become last. We receive our status based on the service we do to others, without self-seeking gain. Now, I suspect that there's not a soul in this room who hasn't heard what I just had to say. I don't think any of this is news to any of you. We all knew it coming in. See, the issue is not that this teaching is somehow difficult. That's not why we don't see it. The issue is not that we can't understand it or we have trouble realizing it. The problem is that we can think about it, we can know it, we can listen to it and read about it, and 2 minutes later, we can walk out of here and start arguing about, this is why I'm better than you, or this is why I deserve more than you, or this is why I deserve more than what I have. The problem is that we're like the disciples. It just goes right over our heads. Boop. We don't want to understand it because we're afraid that if our eyes are really opened, like that blind man, that our lives will be changed, that we'll become a different person, that we'll actually begin to live it. And we're afraid of that. And so may we be like the disciples whose lives were actually transformed when they saw it, when their eyes were opened, and who each bore their own crosses unto the death. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.